So, as we continue through the sermon series, we're continuing to remind you of what we're looking to do with and the vision that we have here is that SEC Payette is stepping into its God-given identity by helping others through self-discovery, transformation, empowerment, and hope through the knowledge of Jesus Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit. And the mission statement, which is similar to it, this thing will work, is experiencing change and growth through the power and love of Jesus Christ. And so all of this is not just about the idea of what we were wanting to do as a church, but also the reality of what it looks like to be a Christian in general, that these are the general ways that it works, that the church is looking to help grow people and lead people in these directions through these specific ideas that we have been talking about. And now we've moved into the place of the values of the church. We've already talked about patience, kindness, and trust, but there's also selflessness, truth, forgiveness, and dedication. And so we're taking a look at each of these things to try to better understand what's actually happening in these different cases, what it actually really means and looks like to be able to live these things in our lives, for them to actually exist and make a difference for us. And so what we are talking about today is the idea of selflessness. And this is kind of a weird and interesting one, because you're not going to really find a specific place in the Bible where it really mentions this word. Some of the ideas exist there, but it's not as easy to point out as some of the other ones where you can find them in different lists, or you can find them clearly pointed out or even spoken about. But the other reason why it's kind of weird and hard to talk about is the fact that it's so closely connected to love. Sure, all of these are, but in some ways, this one really can't be disconnected from it. Specifically, if we are going to describe love as the self-sacrificial type, then selflessness plays a very key role in this. And so as we look at it, we have to go back and remember what love is, and that it's the idea of interacting in a way that prioritizes others above yourself, seeking to accomplish what is best for them. And again, it's always trying to do what is best for others, and it's doing that in many ways through prioritizing others above ourselves. And we're going to see that idea specifically as we go throughout this, but this is a very major part of where selflessness plays a role, because we can say that being selfless is the very fuel of love. Maybe that's not the best exact word or way to describe it, but it is such an important aspect or part to love that you can't really separate it from love. You can't separate love from it. The two are so closely connected that we have to understand them together. And so in many ways, I'll probably just be using the word synonymously, because they almost are. Not even fully intentionally, but the idea is that so much of what has been talked about with love has to be talked about here for us to really understand the idea of what being selfless actually looks like. And so we start by going back to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, which again, we've looked at in many of these different values already, but I think when it says it does not insist on its own way, it is not irritable or resentful, is kind of the idea of what we want to look at when it comes to selflessness. Because the reality is that when a person is insisting on getting their own way, or being irritable or resentful, or basically these all describe the idea of unforgiveness or bitterness. And when that exists within a person, they not only can't love or be selfless toward the person to whom they're being that way against, but they can't really be it to anyone else at the same time. Because when they have those realities of unforgiveness, bitterness, that just dwells up in them, they're never going to get to the point where they're okay with even others around them, because their attitude has been so destroyed by what is happening in that situation. Sometimes this happens very specifically because a person is insisting on their own way and only willing to accept their own way as being right, and that leads to these matters because when they're in relationship with others, they're just trying to do what they want, and it causes problems. And when the other person doesn't accept what they say, it leads to these ideas of bitterness and resentfulness. But it can also come from just the different ways that people are treating you, that it can lead you to this reality. And so this is basically what you call one of the major barriers that has to be overcome for us to actually be selfless, that we have to recognize that these things exist very often in our lives, and if they are controlling us, then there is no way we can actually be selfless. There is no way we can actually love others. And so we have to be aware of this, but we also have to still understand what it means and what selflessness actually looks like in general. And we have to go back to Philippians that I used in the Sermon on Love, but specifically on these two verses of doing nothing according to selfish ambition, nor according to self-delusion, but by means of pure humility, considering one another, being over yourselves, each carefully examining not the things of yourselves, but everyone the things of others. And so it's putting the needs and desires and all of that of others over yourself. And again, that's what we talked about. That was part of the definition of love, but that's most specifically the part where selflessness comes and plays a role within this idea of love. And this idea of what we're looking at here is it's not allowing our own desires and self to control everything, but actually looking at and considering others in the process of both how we make our own decisions that seem to have nothing to do with anyone else, and how we make the decisions that very clearly will impact the people around us. But when we get to this point where we're not allowing our own desires, our own means of what we want to be accomplished, but can actually humble ourselves, it leads us to a point where we begin to act more selfless, and you can say less selfish in the process. And so this is what we have to really do, and we have to make this reality a part of who we are when it comes to love, or else we're not going to be truly loving in the way that Jesus loved. We're not going to be truly following his example and doing what we need to be doing. And so this is really the biggest part of it, is we have to prioritize ourselves below others, not to the point of where we're doing nothing for ourselves, but also recognizing that if we all treat each other this way, we actually can go to the point of ignoring our own selves, because others will be taking care of that through doing that basically back to us. We're not loving or being selfless for that reason, but we recognize when everyone's doing it, it will ultimately accomplish that. But we have to begin to play our role, and sometimes you have to take the first step so far that it feels like you're going too far and completely ignoring yourself. But sometimes that's what it takes to truly show others love, to truly be selfless. But I think there's a story that exists within the Bible that actually helps us to understand it, and you can find it in Luke chapter 10. But it's a story in which a man comes to Jesus and asks him what he must do to inherit eternal life. And Jesus tells him, basically asks him a question of what is in the law that you find that says something about this? And the man answers that it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, that's correct. Now go and do likewise. But we get to this point where it says the man was trying to justify himself. And so he asked Jesus the question, who is my neighbor? And this leads into the real story that Jesus actually tells. And it's basically the idea is that the man likely had this idea that if you could, very strictly define neighbor to certain people around him, then he could probably actually be justified in this reality. But likely knowing that the word itself couldn't be so tightly described, he asked this question, hoping that Jesus would answer him in the way he wanted. But we see that Jesus answers very differently than even what most people around him probably would have expected. And so he tells the story saying that there was a man who was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And while he was on the way, he got attacked by robbers, had everything taken from him, and basically was left for dead. And if you understand, and I don't fully understand all of this, but the road that existed there, I don't imagine was very big. Because when you're going from Jerusalem to Jericho, you're going down quite a ways. Jericho, I believe Jericho itself is below sea level, or it's very near it if it's not. And so you're going at least 2,000 feet down, and it's through pretty steep and narrow areas. And so when Jesus says that a priest comes walking by, and when he sees the man, he passes over to the other side, he's still probably not that far away from the man himself, but he goes out of his way to get as far away from him as possible. You know, if you got a cliff on one side, you know, going up, and a cliff going down the other side, you know, the man's probably on one side and he goes all the way to the other, even if, you know, it's getting close to the edge, just so he could show that he was avoiding it. Then it says that a Levite came along and did the very same thing. And then a third man, who is a Samaritan, came along. And what's interesting is it actually says that it's a Samaritan who was going on a journey. And he stops and helps the man, gets him bandaged up and cleaned up, and then takes him to an inn, leaves him there with some money for the guy who owns it to help care for the guy. And he says that when he returns, he'll give him more for whatever needed to be paid for it. And so in response to that story, Jesus asks the man, who is the one who was a neighbor? And he answers rightly, saying the one who had mercy on the guy. And so Jesus tells him to go and do likewise. But there's a lot of different aspects of the story of what the Samaritan was doing that helps display what selflessness looks like. And it starts off with the idea that it specifically states that he was on a journey, where it says nothing of the same kind for the priest or the Levite. It seems like they were just going along, not really having a need to go anywhere or doing anything important, but he had an actual goal. There was somewhere where he was going and intending to go, but he still is the one who stops and goes out of his way to actually help this person. That there was something that basically you can say that selflessness requires some form of sacrifice, that there was something that he did that went beyond just normal general helping people, where on the other hand, the priest and the Levite basically went out of their way in the opposite direction to avoid it as much as possible. And so we begin to see that selflessness actually has this attitude. It makes us step out of the normal way of doing things to go, in a sense, above and beyond for someone else. And that's exactly what the Samaritan does. And so this story, again, helps to display what it means like to be selfless, because that's exactly what the Samaritan did. But we see another little aspect in it of the fact that one of the reasons why the Samaritan can, I guess you can say, more easily do helping out in this manner is the fact that he really had nothing to lose. That on the one hand, the priests and the Levites, you know, they had high positions within the Jewish community, and so at the very least, they could have been considered unclean, even though probably for a very short period of time, and it wouldn't have mattered much. But they didn't want to have to go through any of that ritual stuff. They also didn't want to be stuck associating someone who was probably way below them on the hierarchy. But the Samaritan, you know, not being a Jew at all and being looked down upon by them, he had absolutely nothing to lose by helping this person. And so, again, that's kind of the idea of humility, is getting to the point where you have nothing to lose with this stuff. You get so far down that you realize that it's not going to cost you anything, but yet we still can live in humility when we're not at that point. It might cost us something, but we're willing to take that cost no matter what. And that's what selflessness really means, is it's going and being willing to pay the price even when it's hard to do. But this leads into the idea of what Jesus says about the end of in Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "You heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and shall hate your enemy. But I say to you, be loving your enemies and be praying on behalf of the ones persecuting you, so that you..." Okay. so that you might become sons of your Father, the one in the heavens, because he rises his sun upon evil ones and good ones, and rains upon righteous ones and unrighteous ones. For if you might love the ones loving you, what reward do you have? Are not even the tax collectors doing the same? If you might greet your brothers only, what are you doing extraordinary? Are not even the pagans doing the same? It's this idea that selfless love can be done toward anyone, but what it really becomes is when we start doing it toward people we don't even know, that when we actually start extending it out beyond that. Because again, as Jesus says, if we just do it towards the people we know, we do it toward the people who would do the same thing toward us, we're not really benefiting anything, because most everyone will do something along those lines. Maybe they won't go to the selfless point that we're talking about, but it's still the idea is that they might do nice things for those that they actually care about and like, but when you step out beyond that, it actually goes even farther, and that's what Jesus is calling us to. It's not just the selfless love, but it's going even farther than that. And so being selfless, it goes beyond you and is truly accomplished toward those you don't really know. And so that's what all of this is looking towards. We have to get beyond ourselves. We have to look beyond ourselves and our own wants and desires to actually care about those of others. And it's not just those close around us, but to all other people. That's really where all of this leads. And so basically to finish up and, okay, this isn't working. To sum all of this up is that first, we have to do God's will above our own. And so this is actually where it starts. It's like what Jesus prays in the garden before he's taken to the cross, when he says, Lord, please take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours. Or what we see in the Sermon on the Mount, where it says, your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's getting over our own will for the sake of God's will. That's where it has to start, that we can't really be selfless until we are ultimately selfless before God. And then we can become that toward others as well. And so it leads us to looking towards the needs and desires of others above our own. And so as we begin to get over ourselves and not care as much about what we want to do God's will, it leads us to be doing the same amongst other people as well. And then finally, we have to extend our selflessness and love beyond those that we know well. And so this is really what I think this value of selflessness entails, is that it entails love in the point of prioritizing others above ourselves, of actually looking and seeing other people as more important and living like that's the true, and then going beyond it to the point where we do it not just to those close to us, to those we like, but also to those beyond that, even to what Jesus might say of loving our own enemies, that we have to go even to that point. But it all begins with selflessness. That's really the very thing that helps to drive it, is when we really go beyond ourselves, not just beyond ourselves, but so far beyond ourselves, we're doing it toward all of those around us. And obviously, this is a lot easier said than done. I don't think any of us have ever come close to really doing anything like this. It gets really hard because obviously we live with emotions, and emotions tend to control us. So even if we want to, it's easy to say that we need to get over that bitterness and resentfulness, but it's a lot easier to say that than to truly do it in practice. And it takes a lot to push our feelings and our desires and our wants to the side to actually go out and be selfless in this way. But we have to recognize that that's what God is calling us to. But we also have to remember that in Him calling us to it, we do it by learning and growing in it, not by just going out and automatically having it all figured out. And so what really this means is that we're supposed to start that process, be heading in that direction, and growing in it as the time goes along. And so that's the idea of this value of selflessness, is that's what we want to have our lives show, and that's what God is calling us to. but it's really a process that's going to take a long time for us to get to. In many ways, we'll probably never get there, but the more we start to do this, the more we submit to God's will over our own, the more we'll eventually start to do it with others. And as we do, and the more we do it, the easier it actually becomes to do. But we have to many times begin that process, and we have to start looking at other people and seeing them sometimes for more than we normally do. That even through all their flaws, even through all their hurt that they've done to us, we have to recognize that they're still ones we are supposed to love. And maybe sometimes those are even the ones we actually need to start with by doing this in the first place.